I started tapping my wrist on the 9th day of the trials, and I kept doing it for reasons that had nothing to do with science. The first reason was that the inside of my elbow had gone the color of a bad bruise from the daily draws, and someone in supply finally gave me a roll of medical tape and told me to cover it before it scared the new arrivals. The second reason was simpler. Nobody else was volunteering anymore, and a 6-year-old Calanth girl 2 cots down from the draw station kept asking the nurses, in that flat, careful way the Calanths speak when they're trying not to sound afraid, whether the humans were going to stop giving blood now that it wasn't working. It wasn't working. I want to say that plainly, because everything that came after only matters against how badly it wasn't working. The girl's name was Tessa Halwyn Vey, and she had picked up the human half of her name from one of the relief workers in the first week of the convoy's arrival, the way the youngest Calanths seemed to do, grafting our names onto theirs like a kind of hopeful claim on the future. She wasn't sick herself. Children turned out to be the last to lose their spindle, for reasons nobody had worked out yet. But her mother had already gone through 2 relapses, and Tessa had taken to sitting on an overturned supply crate near the draw station most mornings, watching the line of donors with the particular patience of a child who has learned that adults will eventually answer if you simply outlast their silence. Outpost Holloway sat on the edge of a resettlement strip we'd carved out of a dry river valley, 6 months after the first Calanth convoy came down out of the dark, trailing the hollow fever behind them like smoke off a grass fire. They called it the dimming in their own language, but the field doctors had taken to calling it the hollow fever because of what it did. It ate through something in Calanth blood they called the spindle, a protein their bodies needed to hold a person's temperament steady after dark. Lose enough spindle and a Calanth didn't turn monstrous exactly. They turned hollow, calm in daylight, controlled, even gentle. Then the sun went down and something underneath all that control came loose, and you did not want to be near them, and they did not want to be near themselves either, judging by how some of them wept afterward when they remembered what they'd done. Dr. Yeshit Corvin ran the anti-serum trials out of a converted grain silo we'd started calling the Tessing Bay, mostly because nobody could agree on a name and that one stuck. She was Calanth, mid-cycle by their reckoning, which I understood loosely as somewhere past 40 in hours, with the patient, unhurried hands of someone who had done careful work her whole life and was watching that work fail in real time. Every batch of anti-serum she synthesized held for a night, sometimes 2, and then the patient's spindle count dropped again and the dimming came back worse than before, like the treatment was teaching the disease something. I gave blood every morning at first light because the trial protocol called for fresh draws before any of us had eaten, and because I had been a field nurse for 11 years before any of this started, and I knew how to hold still for a needle without flinching, which mattered more than people think when you're doing 40 draws a day on people who are terrified of what's living in their own veins. I was not special. I want that understood. I was simply there, and steady, and willing on the mornings when willing was getting harder to find. The tape started as nothing. I'd write the date on it in pen, just so the techs running the panel didn't mix up my sample with the rotating batch of other donors, back when there still was a rotating batch of other donors. One by one the others stopped coming. The draws hurt worse than advertised. The hours were brutal. The work felt, by every visible measure, like it was accomplishing exactly nothing. I kept coming because the 6-year-old kept asking, and because stopping felt like answering her question out loud. So the tape stayed. New strip every dawn, same wrist, same pen, the date written small and square the way I'd been taught to chart in nursing school 20 years before any of this. I didn't think about it as a record. I thought about it as something to do with my hands while I waited for the tech to find a vein. It was Corvin who noticed, and not because she was looking for it. She told me later, and I believe she meant it as confession more than compliment, that she had stopped looking at the donors themselves weeks before. She looked at panels, at protein curves, at failure rates climbing in a way that made her stay in the testing bay past the hour she should have gone to sleep. She was sitting across from me on a morning I remember only because my hands were shaking from the cold, and while the tech found the vein, Corvin's eyes drifted down to my wrist out of simple exhaustion, the kind that makes you stare at whatever's closest because your mind has nothing left to offer the room. She read 3 dates before she understood what she was looking at. Then she asked the tech to bring her the full strip, gently, the way you'd ask someone to hand you something fragile, and she sat with it laid flat across her palm and counted backward. 11 weeks, 76 unbroken mornings, each one dated, each one drawn from the same arm, with no gap longer than a day and no sample ever flagged for spoilage or delay. She asked me very quietly whether I had ever once felt unwell during that span. I told her no, tired, sore at the elbow, nothing worse. She asked whether I understood what I was telling her. I said I didn't, not really. I'd been a nurse, not an immunologist, and none of this was my field. What she explained to me, in a testing bay gone very still around us, was that no Calanth sample in 11 weeks of trials had ever held a clean spindle reading for longer than 9 days running before the fever burned it down again. Mine had held for 76, not because I was being treated for anything, but because my body had never needed the protein at all, and simply kept producing whatever distant human equivalent the fever didn't know how to touch. She had been hunting for a cure built from the Calanth's own chemistry, refining and failing, while the actual answer had been redated in ballpoint pen and stuck to a stranger's wrist the entire time, ordinary as a grocery list, because nobody had thought to read it as data instead of habit. She asked, almost apologetically, whether she could keep the old strips, the ones I'd peeled off and dropped in the bin without a second thought. I told her I hadn't kept any. She checked the bin anyway, on her hands and knees at some hour past midnight, and found 4 still intact among the gauze. Enough to confirm the run hadn't been a clerical accident in the panel software. Watching her do that, I felt faintly embarrassed that something I'd thrown away without looking at it twice had mattered enough for a senior physician to go looking for it in the trash. I won't pretend I understood the biology that followed. I understood the part where they drew more from me than they ever had before, careful and apologetic about it, and synthesized something new from what they found, and tested it on a Calanth man named Ostrin Vey who hadn't slept through a full night without restraints in 4 months. He slept 12 hours. He woke up Calanth and calm and himself, on both sides of sunset for the first time since the convoy came down out of the dark. I was there 3 mornings later when Corvin came to find me at the draw station before the tech had even arrived. She had a fresh strip of tape in her hand, cut to size, and she asked if she could do it herself this time. I held still and let her. She wrote the date the way I always had, small and square, no different from any other morning except that her hands weren't quite steady doing it, and she didn't look away from my wrist once the whole time, like she was making sure the number was real. 79, she said when she finished, though we both knew the count by then. She pressed the edge of the tape down flat with her thumb, the way you'd settle something you intended to keep. I never thought of the tape as anything but a habit I couldn't seem to drop. It turns out the longest, dullest, most ordinary record in that entire outpost was the one that mattered, and nobody had to be a hero to make it. They only had to keep showing up, one unremarkable morning after another, until the dates added up to something worth reading. Tessa was still sitting on her crate that morning, the way she always was, and when I walked past with the new strip fresh on my wrist she asked, the way she'd asked everyone for months, whether the humans were going to keep giving blood. I told her we were. She didn't smile, Calanth children rarely do, not the way ours might, but she nodded once slowly and went back to watching the line, satisfied for that day in the particular way of someone who has finally been told something true.